Good afternoon and welcome to the CERIAS Security Seminar. Our speaker this afternoon will be David Zage, who's a PhD candidate in the Department of Computer Science. David, take it away.
Thank you. So today I'll be presenting some of my thesis work entitled A Platform Creating Efficient, Robust, and Resilient Peer-to-Peer Systems. Just as a note, feel free to raise your hand and interrupt if you have questions. I'd rather answer them as you get them than save them to the end. So just let me know if you do have questions. So first we'll look at a bit of background. And so recently there's been a large growth in communication networks such as the internet. And along with this growth, there's been a large growth in number of users as well as devices. By the year 2015, there are supposed to be over 15 billion network devices and somewhere close to 4 to 5 billion network users. So along with this explosion in the number of devices and the interest in networking in general, there's been a large growth in the number of peer-to-peer applications. There's file distribution such as BitTorrent, voice over IP such as Skype, internet streaming such as ESM and PP Live, as well as distributed computation such as folding at home. And if we actually look at the graph on the right-hand side of the image, we can see that in the year 1998 there was almost no peer-to-peer traffic. However, by the year time 2004 rolls around, which is the newest data that we have, that nearly 50% of the traffic going across the internet consisted of peer-to-peer traffic. So in order to enable these applications, many peer-to-peer applications are built on top of overlay networks. And overlay networks have been proposed to increase and improve the performance of these applications, as oftentimes the end-to-end paradigm that the internet has is not sufficient for providing the service guarantees that the applications need. In essence, an overlay network is just a collection of nodes connected by a set of virtual links, and these virtual links may consist of one or more actual hardware links. And what overlay networks provide is they provide increased capacity. As more nodes join the network, they have greater computational power and greater storage. As more nodes join the network, there's increased performance because of the increasing computational power and things like RAM. And finally, there's increased reliability. There's more storage, so obviously you can store information at multiple points in the network, as well as multiple virtual links can connect nodes, adding to the redundancy in the network and redundancy in routing. So with this large growth in peer-to-peer networks and overlay networks, there's been a focus on actually getting these out in the public and actually getting these to be high performance and well liked by users. This includes working on things such as adaptivity mechanisms and network awareness and incorporating these into the peer-to-peer systems. However, there's been little work on actually creating robust and resilient systems in adversarial environments. Oftentimes, these systems are designed to be deployed in benign environments where all the nodes cooperate, and that oftentimes the proposed systems and mechanisms are vulnerable to attack. So these attacks actually come from two main points. The first is that peer-to-peer applications are deployed in open environments. As I was saying, these applications are often deployed across the internet, which makes them vulnerable to malicious attacks coming from outside the network. And secondly, peer-to-peer applications push the trust of the network towards the fringes of the internet, push it towards the end user nodes, which have been shown to be more insecure. So this means that the systems themselves are actually vulnerable to malicious attacks from inside of the application. So they are actually vulnerable to attacks from users that have legitimate access to the system. What this means is the fact that traditional security mechanisms such as digital signatures and access control are not actually enough to provide security for the system. So this talk will focus on enabling secure, resilient, and high-performance peer-to-peer systems in adversarial environments through the creation of robust system components. We want to look at reconciling the performance of the security of peer-to-peer systems with and identifying and characterizing three critical components. The first being network awareness, the second being intelligent adaptation, and the third being responsiveness to identified threats. And today we'll actually look at the first two. So the first component is looking at robust network awareness. And robust network awareness, in essence, is the ability of an application to measure the network around it and take the measurements into account and make decisions on how to provide better performance for the user or for the system. Often, many of these systems today actually are able to provide network awareness, but in heavyweight manners. A system will have each node probe a subset of the entire network in order to gain information about the network, and then use this information to make better decisions or to adapt the structure of the system. However, this creates a lot of overhead in the system, and it's not actually going towards the end goal, providing a service towards the user. And if we have multiple systems running on the network, then this overhead is actually incurred for each of the systems. So in order to provide a lightweight mechanism for providing network awareness, virtual coordinate systems have been proposed. And these allow hosts on the internet to predict the latency between an arbitrary host in a scalable manner. Basically, each host in a network is provided with a coordinate, and the difference between these coordinates is the estimated round-trip time between two nodes. If we look at the bottom of the screen, we can see an actual topology of just 4 simple computers, and each connected by links around the outside as a link to the middle. Now, actual measurements have been conducted across the outside but not through the middle, and the gray servers wish to communicate. And they're trying to determine which link will provide them the best performance. If we have a coordinate system, they can simply take the difference between their two coordinates and find out that the middle link is the shortest link without having to do any additional probing of the network. The accuracy of these systems is measured by the prediction error, and 2 main architectures for the systems have emerged. One being a landmark base, which has fixed points from which distances are calculated, and the second is a completely decentralized version. As peer-to-peer systems are decentralized and oftentimes do not have any centralized structure, we focus on these type of systems. So as I was saying, they have no fixed infrastructure nodes, and while there are many different types of decentralized virtual coordinate systems, they have 3 common characteristics. The first being a reference set or neighbor set of nodes. This being each node in the network is assigned a reference set of nodes from which to receive information from. So it'll periodically probe these nodes in order to gain information like the round trip time to the node as well as that node's coordinates. A distance prediction mechanism. The coordinate system is actually takes real latency estimates and embeds them in a Euclidean or non-Euclidean space, and so the distance prediction mechanism is simply the Euclidean distance between 2 points. And finally, an error minimization technique. In order to minimize the error occurring in the entire network, these systems use an error minimization technique. Oftentimes, newer systems use things based on physical constants, such as, for example, if we imagine that every node is connected to other nodes by springs, we want to relax the tension on the springs across the entire network in order to minimize the error in the entire system. Some example systems include Vivaldi, pick, and p-chord. I'll go over Vivaldi and a few more in the slides, coming slides for a little bit more detail and a little bit more understanding. And you should note once again that the accuracy relies on the assumption that these nodes behave correctly with the protocol. So here's an example, or here's a more in-depth description of the Vivaldi virtual coordinate system. So as I was saying, is it takes latency measurements and actually embeds these measurements in a multi-dimensional Euclidean space. Here we use 2D examples just for ease of use. We can use multiple more dimensions if we wish for better accuracy. Each pair of nodes is logically connected by a spring, and the length of the spring is simply the estimate of the round-trip time between the two nodes, and the tension on the spring is the error. If we look at the top graph, we can see that the anchor node is connected to the green node, and it has an estimated round-trip time of 50 milliseconds as shown by the spring, whereas the real round-trip time is 20 milliseconds as denoted by the blue arrow. Now, in order to actually make this better and actually make the estimate more accurate, what will happen is the green node will actually move towards the node that it probed, being the anchor node, and so it updated its position based on the received information. So here we can see that now in the bottom half of the picture, we can see that the estimated round-trip time is 30 milliseconds, whereas the actual is 20. And we can see this is a much closer estimate. The reason that it didn't actually have the estimate match the actual is the fact that it's actually connected to over more nodes and more neighbors that is trying to reduce this tension on those springs also. And so it's doing its best to minimize the error on all the links that's connected to. So the correct functioning of these protocols is actually very dependent on the fact that the nodes participate honestly with the protocol, and that each node actually blindly accepts information across the network. And this is the impetus behind the attacks in virtual coordinate systems, is that the honest nodes will blindly accept information even if it's from malicious nodes. So we actually classify 3 types of attack, being coordinate inflation, coordinate deflation, and coordinate oscillation, which we'll go over a little bit more detail in the coming slides. And we can show that these attacks not only affect the coordinate system, but any application relying on the coordinate system for estimation of latency or round-trip time. The attacker model we use is a bounded percentage of malicious nodes. The attacker has access to all cryptographic keys stored on a compromised node, and compromised nodes can perform any arbitrary action. So they are Byzantine nodes and can perform whatever they want. In order to evaluate the attacks and the effects of our defense mechanisms, we looked at Vivaldi over the peer-to-peer simulator. We used the king topology, which, as you can see from the graph or the chart at the bottom of the screen, it has 1740 nodes and an average round-trip time of 180 milliseconds. And we used 2 metrics, the prediction error and the relative error. The prediction error is the average prediction error across the system of the difference between the estimated and the real round-trip time on a link. So for King and for Vivaldi, the average prediction error is on the order of a few milliseconds, and the relative error is the error of the system under attack versus not under attack. So the first 2 types of attacks we look at are the inflation and deflation attacks. The first type of attack, the inflation attack, the attacker is actually able to manipulate the metrics to push a node away from its current position. So we can see from the graph, the node under a no attack scenario would be located at the blue triangle, and it has a prediction error of about 10 milliseconds. So if it's about 100 milliseconds away from one of its neighbors, it might say it's 95 to 90 milliseconds, but that's usually an acceptable amount of error for most systems. However, under the attack, it is now pushed to where the red square is located, and now has a prediction error of nearly 70 milliseconds, or 7 times worse than it did under the no attack scenarios. Similarly, the deflation attack actually manipulates metrics to hold a node at its current position. Here we can see that the benign node is once again forced to be held at the origin of the coordinate system and has a prediction error of nearly 60 milliseconds, or 6 times worse than it did under the no attack scenario. So taking a closer look at how these attacks actually occur and what's the actual underlying behind them, we can see that on the left-hand side, there's no attack occurring, and there's little tension on the spring. Now, in order for the attacker to actually perform the inflation attack, he wants to pull the node or push the node towards a desired location. So in the middle graph, we can see that the malicious node, denoted by the red node, is actually able to report a position very far away from the benign node, and a low error which actually caused the node to move towards the malicious node. And similarly, for the third type, we actually have the malicious node. It reports a coordinate close to the benign node, but a very high latency, which actually pushes the node towards a desired location. And so each of these attacks can actually target one or more nodes or subset or the entire actual coordinate system. For the deflation attack, the attacker is actually able to match the real and the estimated round-trip times. So the attacker knows the coordinates of itself and its neighbor node and makes these actually match the estimated latency. And so this will actually causes the node to stay at its current position and will force it to be unable to actually update its position to a more accurate position, as well as the fact that it tricks the node into thinking it has a very low error when in fact it does not. The last type of attack we look at is the oscillation attack. So here is actually 2 movies, if they play here in a second. Yes, and okay, they're actually playing on the screen. And you can see that under the no attack scenario, the system is actually able to form a definite structure. So groups that are close together actually have low round trip times between them, and you can kind of form clusters depending on where their nodes are located. However, under the attack scenario, we can see that the nodes just kind of swarm around without any definite structure. So besides losing this visual structure, the system itself loses the ability to accurately predict the round trip time between nodes. So not only can we see the effects of the attack visually, but we can actually see them on our 2 metrics. We can see that from the left-hand side, which is a system prediction error, and the right-hand side, which is a relative error, that as the number of malicious nodes increases, the effect of the system, the performance of the system becomes worse. So a small percentage of attackers is actually able to generate double or triple the amount of system prediction error and relative error. So there's been some previous work on creating robust virtual coordinate systems. Most of the work is actually focused on just creating low-error virtual coordinate systems that work in benign environments. Other work has shown that virtual coordinate systems are vulnerable to attack, and there's been one or two previous solutions. Some of the previous solutions had looked at the triangle inequality, which is often violated in the internet and not practical to deployed systems. Others use trusted network components or extra sets of nodes in communication. And we wanted to avoid these types of solutions, which actually induce things like actually adding structure or added fixed components to a network, or added extra overhead to what is supposed to be a low overhead system. So our goal was to add robustness by three main points. Is first, to reduce the likelihood of making a poor change. Two is we wanted to maintain the decentralized structure. And three is we wanted to maintain low communication overhead, similar to the design goals of the virtual coordinate systems themselves. In order to do this, we will use local decisions based on local and remote data that's already reported in the system. And the mechanism we use is anomaly detection, so it's multimetric correlation and statistical outlier detection using both spatial and temporal outliers. We want to reduce the number of incorrect changes, and we do this by detecting inconsistencies in the reported data. So we look for inconsistencies with respect to what other nodes in the neighbor set have reported. So for example, if we have a neighbor set of size 64 and say 62 of these nodes are reporting a low error and very little variability in the coordinates, and 2 of the nodes are varying wildly, these nodes will be detected as being inconsistent and possibly malicious and avoided for use in actually updating a node's coordinates. Second, we look for inconsistencies between reported metrics for an individual node. So for example, if a node says it has low error but it has a very variable coordinate, these are inconsistent with each other, and thus the update will be considered malicious. And finally, we look for inconsistencies with the past history. Does what the node is reporting now remain consistent with what was reported in the past? So for a little more detail on spatial outlier detection, we look at using local and remote data already used in the system. So we use RTT, the remote error, and the change in the remote coordinates in order to determine if a node is a spatial outlier or not. We do this by collecting a set of samples. So we use the most recent 64 samples, and by using this data set we compute a centroid. So here on the graph we can see the centroid is denoted by the red triangle. And then the distance from the centroid is computed using the Mahalanobis distance, and anything that's beyond the set threshold, here denoted by the ellipse, is determined to be a malicious update. Anything within the ellipse is actually denoted as a benign update and used to update the node's coordinates. The reason we use the Mahalanobis distance is it's good at detecting multiple attributes. It takes into account both the variance and covariance of the attributes. So in other words, attributes that have high variance receive less weight than those that have a low variance. So things that are more stable should be accounted more highly in whether or not something is malicious. And finally, it takes into consideration the correlation between the attributes. And since we have an environment that has multiple attributes that are correlated, this is a perfect type of distance measure. For our temporal outlier detection, we actually use a 5-tuple. We use a little bit more data, and we use the RTT, remote error, local error, the change in remote coordinates, and change in local coordinates. And for each of these, in order to avoid having to store the entire history of a node's interactions with each other, we simply store a temporal centroid. And what this consists of is the mean, the standard deviation, and the sample count. And so for each interaction the node has with other neighbors, it maintains these 3 metrics. And then we use a simplified Mahalanobis distance in order to determine if the update is an outlier or not. And so to put it all together, quite simply, if the tuple is not a temporal outlier and it's not a spatial outlier, well then the data is used to update a node's current coordinates and error, and is included in the data set that is used to calculate the spatial and temporal centroids. Otherwise, it is rejected as being potentially malicious and is not used in future calculations. So to actually look at the effects of our mitigation techniques on the system, here we look at a various percentage of attackers using a spatial threshold of 1.5. And we can see that our mechanism is actually able to mitigate the attacks. If we look at the blue and the purple triangle lines, we can see that with no detection, the relative error is around 2.5 times what it is under no attack. So this means the system is operating 2.5 times worse than it was. And then with our detection technique, we can see that the relative error returns to just a little bit above 1, even when 30% of the network is malicious. What's also interesting to note is that if we look at the red and the blue lines, which are the 20% attackers, if we look at the 20% using our detection technique, we can see that the relative error is actually under 1. So it means with our detection technique, we're actually able to help the system return to performing actually better than it was under the benign scenario without our mechanism. So not only are we able to avoid the malicious updates, we're able to avoid high error benign updates that would otherwise cause spurious changes in the coordinate system. So not only are we able to tolerate the malicious nodes, we're actually able to tolerate malicious coalitions. So what this means is that even if the malicious nodes are working together, our mechanism will still work. And so approximately 30% of the network needs to actually work together in order to subvert our defense mechanisms. As we can see from the chart, we can see that approximately 20 nodes out of a neighbor set of size 64 need to be malicious in order to have any random update bypass our outlier detection technique. And so this actually converts into about 30% of the network. So just a quick summary of robust network awareness. We've seen that virtual coordinate systems provide a lightweight solution for creating network-aware applications. The virtual coordinate systems are vulnerable to malicious activity, and that outlier detection can be leveraged to add robustness to the system. So the second component we'll actually look at is robust adaptation. And so what adaptation allows peer-to-peer systems to do is to be able to change their structure, change their topology, change the way they function in order to better service the system or service the user and to maintain certain service guarantees. For example, if you're watching TV and you need to maintain a certain amount of bandwidth, adaptivity allows the network in order to change its structure to make sure that the user is always receiving enough bandwidth in order to maintain a smooth signal and not have a choppy playback. In order to better look at adaptation, we'll look at a specific type of system and the adaptations that it can actually contain. So we look at an unstructured multicast overlay network. So what this is basically a physical network, and on top of that is built a mesh control plane in which information is distributed about the control plane, about the latency, about information about the network. And using this mesh control plane, the information it provides, on top of that is built a tree-based multicast. And this tree is adapted in order to maintain application-specific performance. So in this case, it's streaming video, so it's trying to make sure that every receiver receives 480 kbps. Since it's unstructured, it's self-organized. There are no constraints on who can be neighbors of who can be a parent, who can be a child. And each node simply maintains a parent, a peer set, as well as a routing table or the children or who it's sending data to. In order to allow the tree to adapt, metrics are collected by the nodes through two techniques. The first being a passive observation of the performance from the source. So a node records how much data it's receiving and the information it's receiving from the source, any data the source is giving it, as well as it periodically probes neighbors or peer nodes around it in order to receive their information and see how they're actually performing. It does this in order to see that if a peer is performing much better than I, then maybe his parent is somebody I should ask to be my parent and receive better bandwidth. So once these metrics are actually collected, they're used to compute a utility function, and then based on the utility function, the node will decide whether or not to actually change its parents. So we use ESM or end system multicast. It's a mature multicast system. It's been used to broadcast things like conference keynotes and other things like that. So the metrics it actually uses is bandwidth, latency, round trip time, loss rate, and the degree. In order to ensure that there's data quality, especially from benign errors, it uses things like data sampling and data smoothing in order to address variations in the metrics, and it uses dampening and randomization hysteresis in order to address instabilities and avoid things like flapping back and forth rapidly between parents or changing routes. In order to actually improve the decision quality that a node does when it's actually deciding whether or not to change its parents, it actually uses several utility functions with a variety of inputs in order to try and find the best decision to take. Once again, it's important to note that the accurate interpretation of these metrics and the observations that they infer are critical to the response of the system. And so there are actually multiple types of attacks that can actually exploit these adaptive mechanisms. And these classifications, or these attacks, can be classified in three broad classifications. First being the attraction attack, repulsion attack, and disruption attack. And we'll look more in detail at the attraction attack. And not only these attacks affect the structure of the system, but they can also be used to facilitate further attacks such as data dropping or analysis of the structure of the system. So the attraction attack is an attack in which a malicious node tries to attract more children in order to have a more important place in the tree. So the more children a node has, or the higher it up is in the tree, the more traffic it controls of the entire system. So for example, if we look at the images on the right hand side, initially the malicious node is one of the leaf nodes of the tree. It's connected at the bottom of the tree and has very little influence over the tree. However, once it performs the attraction attack, we can see that it is now connected directly to the source and actually controls the data being sent to the majority of the tree. And so if it decides to start dropping that data, the majority of the tree will be without the data and not receive the data the source is sending. So in order for the attacker to actually manipulate the structure of the tree, it simply manipulates the information it's reporting to its peer nodes. So it manipulates the metrics. It says it has good bandwidth, low latency, and a few children, and this results in a significant number of nodes actually connecting to it and requesting it to be their parent. So here we can actually see the effect of the attraction attack on ESM. So there are actually two lines here. The first line, being the black line, is actually a naive attack in which the malicious nodes simply drop data without trying to obtain advantageous positions in the network. And we can see that even when there are 30% malicious nodes in the network, they have very little effect on the overall performance of the system, and most of the nodes maintain 480 kbps. However, as the nodes perform attraction attacks in combination with just dropping of data, we can see that the performance of the system begins to degrade. And we can see that as the number of malicious nodes increases, the performance continues to degrade. We can see with 30% malicious nodes, the bandwidth is actually dropped to about 200 kilobits per second, or about 25% of what the system is actually able to perform. And not only does the performance of the system suffer, the stability of the system and the number of change that is required also begins to greatly increase. We can see from the left-hand graph that on the no attack scenario, the system is able to maintain 480 kilobits per second, and when it first starts up, there's a few parent changes. We can see that the number of black impulses, there's a fair number at the beginning of the system when nodes are trying to find good parents, and then occasionally throughout the lifetime of the system, a node will need to change parents in order to maintain its performance. However, when under attack, we can see that there are many parent changes to both good and bad nodes, and the number of attacks, or the malicious attack actually quadruples the number of adaptation changes in the network. So the network has become much more unstable and much more variable because of the introduction of malicious nodes. So there's been some prior work looking at robust adaptation. So the adaptivity can be exploited, has been shown in different systems such as TCP. Other work has looked at using trusted components in order to make sure that the adaptation decisions are correct, as well as using things like induced churn, but these systems often are high in cost and induce new components into the system. Other work has looked at selfish behavior, but this assumes that the nodes are simply selfish and not malicious. And finally, other defensive techniques have looked at structured overlay networks, which have a very different structure and can actually leverage this structure in order to maintain or make certain guarantees about who can be children and who can't be. And since we are in a completely unstructured network, we don't have any of these guarantees we can leverage. So the goal here is to create robust and adaptive components. And we want to prevent incorrect adaptations based on malicious data. So we want to actually use local decisions based on locally and partially observable global context. So there's actually two mechanisms we leverage. The first being the correlation of control plane and data plane information, and the second being context-sensitive outlier detection. We kind of think of these mechanisms as they won't be perfect and they won't stop every attack, but what they do is they raise the bar for the attacker to be much higher and much harder for them to actually attack the system and gain something out of it. So you can kind of think of it like the picture on the right-hand side is a castle. So a castle without a moat is hard to attack. A castle with a moat is slightly harder. And so our techniques are actually adding the moat around the castle in order to make the systems less vulnerable to malicious attack. So in order to use the control plane and data plane information to add robustness, that, as I was mentioning before, each of the nodes periodically probes its peers for information. As it receives its information back from its peers, a node will construct a path graph, as shown here at the bottom of the slide. And what it actually does is it uses this path graph in order to check the sanity of the data it is receiving back from its peers and neighbors. And so it can use this path graph to actually improve the decision performance by seeing if what is actually reported is correct. Now, for example, if we take the red node here as to be malicious, and if the red node were to report that it had no children to a node that constructed this path graph, it would actually be able to determine that this node is actually lying to it because it actually is able to see 2 children and 3 grandchildren as being part of this node's subtree and avoid this node as a potential parent, and so thus potentially avoid a bad situation. So as I was saying, as each node probes peers for information, it will construct the path graph, and each node will construct it for each set of probe responses that it receives, and if the inconsistencies occur, the node will be temporarily avoided as a parent. And we can see from the graph that while the system doesn't return to an optimal performance of 480 kbps, the improvement in bandwidth is nearly 200 kilobits per second for a very lightweight solution. You can see it went back up from 200 to nearly 400 kilobits per second, and this is with 30% malicious nodes. Not only does the performance of the system improve, the stability of the system also improves. We can see that when the system is working in a non-malicious scenario, there's a total of 411 parent changes. With no defense, this once again quadruples to about 1,600, and with our defense techniques, it drops back down to about 650, or a slight increase over the original without any defense and without any attack. So as a quick summary, we can see that the ability to adapt and change to network conditions and to maintain performance is critical to these systems. These adaptation mechanisms are vulnerable to malicious attack, and our experiments demonstrate that our techniques improve the adaptation process and the overall stability of the system while limiting the effects of a malicious node, and also while incurring very little overhead on the actual system and not requiring any additional components. So finally, we'll actually look at using some of these components in peer-to-peer systems. So we actually look at using a robust virtual coordinate system, so robust network awareness in the core DHT. The core DHT is basically an efficient key value store, so each value that is placed into the core system is given a key, and you can search for the items based on this key, and then the item will be returned. So each node is given an identifier and a subset of values and is placed into a ring. So for example here we can see a ring that has 256 identifiers. Each node is given a ring, and each node will maintain a subset of the data placed in the system. And each node in the system will maintain a predecessor, so the node that is before in the ring, the successor, the node after in the ring, the fingers, which can be thought of shortcuts across the ring, and finally a subset of values. So for example, if the node 100 here wanted to actually look up a value 230 in the system, it would simply send a message request across the structure and across the ring using its first finger table here, which points to 197. Then 197 would pass the message along to its successors in order to actually find the data value 230, which is also stored at the node that has the identifier 230. So in order to actually improve the performance of the core DHT, the finger nodes can be chosen at random. However, there are better choices than just random, as in that there are multiple choices for each finger node, and the finger node with the lowest latency to the corresponding node can be chosen. And so there are two ways to actually do this. The first is through to probe all the finger nodes and check the responses, or to actually use the virtual coordinate system. So we can see on the right hand side we have our internet, and on top of that we have the Vivaldi system, which collects round trip measurements from the internet, and finally we have Chord built on top of Vivaldi, which uses the virtual coordinates to actually choose the best finger nodes. And so we actually can show that a non-robust virtual coordinate system can lead to attacks on the system and lead to poor performance of the DHT. And so here we actually look at using a non-robust virtual coordinate system for latency estimation. And we can see that as the number of attackers increases, the lookup latency for the system begins to increase, and it increases with each percentage of malicious nodes added. And with 30% malicious nodes, an average lookup of the DHT takes approximately 50% longer when the attackers are present. One important thing to note is the fact that this attack actually causes no visible effects on the overlying system other than the degradation in the performance, which wouldn't normally typically be caught by the user. So all the other metrics of the system stay the same, the lookup rate stays the same, the success ratio stays the same. And so this attack would be very hard to defend against at an upper level and can only be defended against at the lower level system. So in order to actually add robustness to the virtual coordinate system, we discussed earlier, we used the outlier detection. And we can see here that the different detection techniques and the different percentage of malicious nodes, we can actually maintain the performance of the DHT or actually improve it because some of the fingers are actually better choices. And so using the robust coordinate system, we can see that the normalized lookup delay for 10% malicious nodes is 0.93, or 7% better than it was with using just the normal virtual coordinate system. And we can see that without that, the performance of the system actually suffers. So in summary, we can see that the malicious nodes can attack the lower level systems and detrimentally affect the upper level systems, and that these attacks have very little effect except to actually undermine the performance of the system. And finally, deploying a robust network awareness component is actually able to preserve the application performance. So in conclusion, peer-to-peer systems will continue to grow in importance. The open nature and the lack of security often make these protocols vulnerable to attack. And so here we looked at actually developing a framework of robust components which can be incorporated into current or new peer-to-peer systems in order to make them robust. These components include robust adaptation, network awareness, and responsiveness to identify threats. And we demonstrated the utility of these components in actual peer-to-peer systems. So are there any questions? Or did I just go over everyone's head?
David,
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned that you implemented this in, was it Chord DHT?
Right.
Do you think that the implementation would work equally well in other implementations of DHTs?
So I think it'll work. It actually, we've done it in other work and other systems, and does work equally well, as well as the fact that Core DHT, since it is a structured system that uses very strict constraints on who can be neighbors and who can't, and it really limits the neighbor set, it actually works better in other systems that have more freedom. We wanted to show that even in a system that has such guarantees, it can still be attacked and that our techniques can still work. So it actually worked better in unstructured systems than even the Chord system, but it works in other things like Kademlia and other DHTs. And so all those works, and so all these works have actually been deployed in real networks and across things like Planet Labs to actually run across large-scale systems with multiple hundreds of nodes. And so they actually do work across like a real actual working systems.
Would this approach work in a wireless mesh network? Has that approach been examined?
So which approach? Just
just the
using the components to build a more secure system.
Yes.
So it would work in pretty much any type of system in which a lot of systems are built on top of each other, and so you have one system, one subsystem which then are built on top of in order to make higher level applications. And so any application where you have that type of structure, these things will actually help. And so while the wireless mesh networks and wireless networks in general use different types of actual latency estimation systems, there are actually virtual coordinate systems and coordinate systems for wireless networks that work in very similar manners and can be used in similar manners. So yes, it's applicable to pretty much any type of networking. I mean, we focused in the work on wired networking, but a lot of the same techniques and principles would transfer to wireless with some augmentation. Any other questions?